The morning of February 24th, 1944, began with frost so thick it filmed the inside of the canopy on Karl Weber's Messerschmitt Bf 109. He rubbed at it with his wool sleeve, but the chill only smeared the ice. The young lieutenant had flown little in recent weeks. There was no fuel for practice flights, no reserve for maneuvers. On paper, the Luftwaffe still listed more than 1,000 serviceable single-engine fighters across the Reich. In reality, many sat immobile, their tanks dry, their pilots grounded. Karl's squadron at Verneuchen, outside Berlin, received more ration chits for coal than for gasoline. He stepped onto the tarmac, where mechanics huddled with blackened fingers, lighting cigarettes against the biting wind. The air smelled of benzol and synthetic oils, Germany's desperate substitutes for the petroleum the Allies were already targeting. Above, he caught the first faint lines of contrails, ghostly white against the steel sky. They stretched across the horizon in parallel ranks, so many they blurred into one another. He had seen bomber streams before, but never this dense, never this deep. At 22, Karl still clung to the mythology of the Luftwaffe ace. He had grown up on stories of Galland and Milders, of the Battle of Britain and duels where one man's skill tilted the sky. Yet as he watched, the sky itself seemed conquered. Hundreds of aircraft formed what looked less like formations and more like an airborne continent, lumbering eastward with inexorable patience. He thought of the statistics whispered in the ready room. America had produced nearly 100,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, more than Germany could manage in the entire war. That number sounded like propaganda until he saw the contrails, countless and unbroken. His flight leader barked that they would scramble if fuel permitted, though they all knew it wouldn't. Half the pilots in his staffel had logged fewer than 20 combat hours. Some had been pulled from gliders or even bicycles in training fields when aviation gasoline ran out. The only certainty was that another group of American bombers would arrive tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after still. Karl pulled his leather jacket tight as the roar of engines echoed overhead. His Messerschmitt sat silent, frost creeping down its wings. He realized with sudden clarity that the frost was permanent, that the Reich's Air Force was freezing in place while the enemies filled the sky. Above Berlin, the sky was no longer German. It belonged to the arsenal of democracy. Thousands of miles away, in Willow Run, Michigan, Clara Miller wiped a streak of grease across her cheek as another B-24 Liberator slid off the assembly line. She had once worked a typewriter at a Detroit office. Now, her hands guided aluminum skins into place as rivet guns hammered like machine guns in the cavernous hall. The plant was Ford's masterpiece, a mile-long line turning out one bomber every hour. By the end of the war, Willow Run alone would deliver 8,685 Liberators, more aircraft than some nations produced in total. The plant smelled of oil, sweat, and hot metal. Women in bandanas climbed scaffolds, fastening tail assemblies. Men too old for the draft pushed carts of ball turrets and engines. Clara thought often of her brother, a waist gunner in a B-17 flying somewhere over Europe. She knew that each bomber required 10 men like him and thousands like her. The rivets she drove today might hold his life tomorrow. The numbers defied imagination. Across America, factories would produce 96,318 aircraft in 1944 alone. That meant more than 260 new machines rolling out every day. Japan would never match that total across the entire war. A single American year outweighed an enemy decade. These weren't abstract figures to Clara. They were visible in the endless crates of engines stacked to the rafters, in the streams of aluminum trucks backing into the loading bays, in the bulletin boards tallying hourly output. She sometimes wondered how such abundance looked from the other side. Did the enemy pilot glance up at bomber formations and understand he was fighting not just machines, but a nation of factories? Did he sense the hands of riveters in Michigan, welders in Seattle, machinists in Dallas, all converging in the sky above him? Clara could not know, but she sensed that for every frost-covered German cockpit, there would be another bomber emerging from Willow Run, gleaming and ready. As the siren signaled the end of her shift, Clara stepped outside into the Michigan cold. Across the snow-dusted lot, finished B-24s stood wing to wing, their propellers glinting in the low sun. They looked less like aircraft than like promises, steel and aluminum commitments to men who would never meet her, but who would trust her work with their lives. Tomorrow, she would be back at the line. Tomorrow, another bomber would roll past her station, then another, and another still. Somewhere across the Atlantic, the frost would cling to German cockpits, but here the machines never stopped moving. What Carl Weber saw overhead in Berlin began here, in the thundering heart of Willow Run. The February dawn at RAF Bodney painted the English countryside in a pale mist. Captain James Harrington pulled his flight jacket tight as he walked across the wet tarmac, boots crunching on grit. Before him stood his P-51 Mustang, its nose painted in the unmistakable cobalt blue of the 352nd Fighter Group. The ground crew had already filled the wing tanks and mounted the drop tanks under the fuselage, extra fuel that would carry him all the way to Berlin and back. For years, the Luftwaffe had fought with the certainty that no single-engine fighter could escort bombers so deep into the Reich. Today, the blue-nosed Mustangs would prove them wrong. Harrington's Mustang bore the designation P-51D, fitted with the Packard-built Merlin 5 1650 engine. The men loved to boast it could climb like a homesick angel, but the real miracle was its range, nearly 1,530 miles with those external tanks. The Americans had finally solved the bomber escort problem that cost them so dearly in 1943. He thought of Schweinfurt, of the fortress formations chewed apart by German fighters. That doctrine was gone now. 8 Fighter Command had made it clear. The priority was no longer simply to guard bombers, but to hunt and kill the Luftwaffe wherever it rose. The air stank of aviation fuel and exhaust as engines fired one by one, Mustangs lined up in pairs like racers at a starting line. Harrington adjusted his oxygen mask and glanced at the photo taped beside his gun sight, his wife, smiling in a Kansas summer dress. He thought of her as the tower cleared them for takeoff. One by one, blue noses lifted from the runway, wheels tucking beneath wings, propellers flashing in the morning light. They climbed eastward over the channel, contrails beginning to stream above them. Soon they would merge with the bomber stream, hundreds of B-17 and B-24s lumbering toward the Reich. The formations stretched horizon to horizon, each bomber carrying up to 6,000 pounds of bombs, sometimes 8,000 on shorter missions. From above, the sight looked less like airplanes than like a mechanized weather front rolling toward Europe. Harrington's duty was to guard that storm, to make sure it arrived intact. As they crossed into German airspace, he could already see black dots rising far off, Messerschmitts climbing to intercept. His squadron leader's voice crackled in his headset. "Blue flight. Break high. Let's clean house." Harrington pushed his throttle forward. The Merlin roared. He thought not of dogfights, but of factories, of fuel, of numbers so vast the Luftwaffe could never match them. He was one man among thousands, but together they were a tide. The blue noses of Bodney cut into the German sky like a declaration. The Luftwaffe's day was ending. On February 25, 1944, Carl Weber stood in the freezing air near Berlin as the sky thickened with contrails. He knew this was no ordinary raid. It was part of Operation Argument, Big Week, the Allied attempt to break the German aircraft industry in a single hammer blow. The targets were Augsburg, Regensburg, Gotha, Oschersleben, names whispered with dread in Luftwaffe ready rooms. If the Americans succeeded, Germany would not just lose factories, it would lose the ability to contest the sky. The first wave came at midday. B-17s, hundreds of them, each droning with 4 Wright Cyclone engines, each bristling with 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns. Their formation discipline was astonishing, rectangles of silver geometry pushing through the haze. Behind them, the deeper growl of B-24 Liberators, broader wings and longer range, filled the sky. Together they carried bomb loads measured in thousands of tons. Karl's Staffel had been ordered to intercept, but fuel allocations grounded half their aircraft. Only a handful scrambled, climbing steeply into the contrail forest. He watched them disappear into the cloud, knowing most would not return. Losses were mounting on both sides. That day alone, the U.S. 8th Air Force would lose 31 bombers and 3 fighters. But the math was cruel. In Detroit, Seattle, and Fort Worth, those losses would be replaced in less than a single day's production. The Luftwaffe's veteran pilots spoke grimly of exhaustion. Each mission bled them of men who could never be replaced. Training schools had been cut to bare hours, boys with less than 20 flight hours sent into combat against American aces seasoned over months of escort duty. Karl felt the despair of numbers pressed down harder than the flak bursts exploding above the city. As the bombers droned past, he saw something that chilled him more than the cold. Among the contrails, small, fast shapes weaved in and out. Mustangs, blue-nosed fighters. They were not turning back over the Ruhr as expected. They were circling even here, above Berlin. Karl's chest tightened. If single-engine escorts could reach this far, then there was no safe sky left in Germany. The ground shook as the bombs fell on the city's industrial belt. Karl pressed his hands to his ears as the thunder rolled across frozen fields. He thought of his Messerschmitt sitting idle, its tank nearly empty. Around him, other pilots cursed. But none spoke aloud what he felt. The Luftwaffe's death warrant had been signed. As the last bombers vanished into the east, Karl whispered to himself, the sky no longer belonged to Germany. It belonged to America's factories. Captain James Harrington rolled his P-51 Mustang onto its side, the horizon tilting as tracers climbed toward him from the Berlin flak towers. The sky was alive with movement, bombers in tight boxes, German fighters diving through, contrails slicing like chalk lines across the blue. He shoved his throttle forward, the Merlin Phi 1650 roaring as he closed on a fleeing Focke-Wulf 190. The Mustang's 6.50 caliber guns rattled, brass casings flashing into the air, and the German fighter burst into a blossom of smoke. Yet Harrington barely had time to register the kill. His orders weren't to chase glory. 8 Fighter Command had shifted the doctrine. Protect the bombers, yes, but above all, destroy the Luftwaffe. He and his squadron had been told to hunt the hunters, to make sure German fighters never regrouped, never recovered, never returned. The bombers held their course with mechanical steadiness, each B-17 Fortress bristling with machine guns, each B-24 Liberator carrying its deadly load. Harrington knew the statistics. A Fortress could haul 6,000 pounds across Europe, and on short hauls nearly 8,000. Multiply that by the hundreds flying today, and Berlin would feel not one hammer blow, but a rainstorm of steel. Below him, he caught glimpses of German airfields. Some Messerschmitts still clawed for altitude, but many stayed grounded, their wings rimed with frost, their tanks empty. He thought of the intelligence briefings. German fuel production collapsing, training time cut so short that some boys had logged fewer hours than American cadets did in a single week. He saw the enemy pilots as brave, but he also saw them as doomed. As his Mustang rejoined the bombers, Harrington marveled at the scale of it all. Hundreds of bombers, hundreds of escorts, all moving with industrial inevitability. For every Fortress that fell in flames, another rolled off a line in Seattle or Kansas City. For every Mustang shot down, another stood ready at Bodny, fueled and waiting. The Luftwaffe could not replace its dead so quickly. He thought of something he'd heard rumored from German broadcasts, a bitter admission attributed to Goering himself. When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up. Whether Goering truly said it or not, Harrington understood why the words carried weight. For the Germans, the sight of blue-nosed fighters circling over their capital must have been the end of belief itself. The formation pressed east, bombs tumbling, flak booming. Harrington tightened his formation and guided his men homeward, knowing the battle was already decided not in the skies above, but in the factories across the Atlantic. Far below, Karl Weber watched the blue noses and whispered the same words. The jig was up. In Normandy, Madame Elise Fournier pressed her children into the cellar as the house trembled from the passing bombers. The sound was unlike any thunder she had ever known, a layered roar that seemed to shake the very stones. Each wave came in endless succession, engines droning, bomb doors clanking open, contrails smearing the sky white. She lit a single candle, shielding its flame with her palm, and tried to pretend the earth was not shaking around them. For years, Elise had lived under German occupation. The boots on cobblestones, the ration cards, the commandeered barn for Wehrmacht horses, all had become grim routine. Yet what unsettled her most was the sky. It no longer belonged to France. It belonged to the occupier by day, and at night it belonged to the bombers. Some neighbors cursed the raids, others whispered hope. To Elise, each passing formation was terrifying, but also a sign that the Germans could not hold forever. Through a crack in the shutters, she sometimes glimpsed the bombers themselves, silver bellies glinting in the sun, wings spanning the horizon. She learned their sounds, the deeper growl of the B-24 Liberator, the steadier thrum of the B-17 Fortress, and always smaller shadows darting alongside, Mustangs weaving like hawks. The occupiers muttered angrily about these American fighters, single-engine escorts that should never have reached this far. Elise didn't understand the technical marvel of their drop tanks or Merlin engines, but she knew what she saw. The Germans were no longer masters of the air. One afternoon, she led her children to the fields after a raid. The earth was pocked with craters, and bits of twisted metal lay scattered in the hedgerows. A farmer neighbor stooped to pick up a fragment stamped with English markings. He showed it to Elise in silence, then tucked it into his pocket as though it were a relic. For them, these fragments meant something larger than destruction. They meant the Allies were coming closer. Elise's children asked if the planes would one day bring food instead of bombs. She hushed them, though in her heart she prayed the same. Each night she whispered stories of freedom, of skies that might once again carry nothing but clouds. When the ground shook again, Elise held her children tight. The sky outside was filled with rumble, but this time her fear mingled with something else, anticipation. She prayed that the thunder in the sky was not death, but the sound of liberation approaching. Karl Weber stood outside the hangar at Verneuchen in the spring of 1944 when the first whispers began, rumors that the Americans were shifting their bombers to oil. At first it seemed absurd. The Allies had hammered factories, rail yards, and cities, but fuel. Germany had little natural petroleum. Everything flowed from synthetic plants, Leuna, Merseburg, Perlitz. These complexes seemed too sprawling, too vital to ever be destroyed. Yet one by one, the raids began to hit them. Karl smelled the results before he saw them. On days when the wind came from the south, the air reeked of burnt benzol and scorched coal tar. The synthetic plant at Leuna had been hit, and the flames licked the sky for days. Pilots returning from missions complained that their tanks had been cut to half fills, then quarter fills. Training flights were canceled altogether. New cadets never touched engines. Some learned procedures standing beside wooden mock-ups. By July, the aviation gasoline output had fallen from 175,000 tons in April to only 30,000. In September, it collapsed to a mere 5,000 tons, a 97% reduction. For Karl, this meant his Messerschmitt sat on the ground more often than not. The once proud Jagdgeschwader became skeletal shadows, squadrons in name only. Planes could be repaired, even replaced, but fuel could not be conjured. He watched sleek Bf-10-9s lined wing to wing along the strip, gleaming in the sun yet lifeless, coffins with no fuel for flight. The irony cut deeper than defeat. Germany had aircraft it could not use. Meanwhile, the skies grew thicker with enemy contrails. The P-51s no longer just escorted. They prowled, circling like wolves even when bombers had passed. The Americans seemed tireless, bottomless, unending. Karl knew the numbers whispered by officers. In 1944 alone, America would produce more aircraft than Germany and Japan combined could ever hope to field. The Luftwaffe wasn't losing battles, it was being strangled at the source. Karl stood one evening as another fuel truck backed into the hangar. It carried barely enough for a single patrol. The mechanics argued over who would fly, while the others resigned themselves to sitting idle. That night, he lay awake to the distant rumble of another raid, another plant in flames. He understood then that oil was not just fuel, it was blood, and the Reich was bleeding out. The frost on his cockpit glass was no longer the enemy. The real enemy was emptiness in the tank. Across the channel, Captain James Harrington prepared for the coming invasion and saw a very different picture of war. In southern England, the lanes and fields were jammed with convoys, miles of olive-drab vehicles stretching as far as the eye could see. The heart of it all was the 2.5-ton GMC truck, the Deuce and a Half. Eisenhower himself would later call it one of the war's true weapons, alongside the landing craft and the Mustang. Harrington marveled at the scale. More than 2.4 million trucks had been procured by the U.S. Army, compared to Germany's meager 350,000. The difference wasn't measured just in numbers, but in mobility. American divisions could move, resupply, and fight at a pace the Wehrmacht, still relying on horses for much of its logistics, could never match. If the Luftwaffe was being choked by empty tanks, the U.S. Army was bursting at the seams with abundance. Even civilians felt the weight of that abundance. Madame Elise Fournier in Normandy saw the first convoys during the build-up to D-Day. Villages overflowed with American soldiers, their camps spilling across orchards. Trucks carried everything: rations, ammunition, fuel cans stacked in gleaming pyramids. To children, the miracle wasn't the vehicles, but the chocolate bars tossed from passing convoys. A single Hershey's square seemed more decadent than anything they had tasted in years. For Harrington, the trucks meant fuel on time, bombs always waiting, spare parts at the ready. He knew German pilots were scraping frost off wings of grounded fighters, while his Mustang was polished, fueled, and waiting at Bodny. The American way of war was not just bravery in the cockpit, it was the relentless machine behind it, the factory worker, the truck driver, the quartermaster. The irony was striking. The Germans still preached of their aces, their traditions, their discipline. But war in 1944 was no longer won by individual skill. It was won by convoys, by assembly lines, by the ability to deliver not just planes but everything a soldier could eat, fire, or carry. As Harrington taxied for yet another escort run, he looked at the convoy snaking through the countryside. He thought of Elise's children catching chocolate bars, of Clara Miller hammering rivets in Michigan, of Karl Weber staring at an empty fuel gauge. The connections were clear now. America had turned abundance into a weapon, and scarcity was killing the Reich. The rumble of trucks on English roads was as decisive as the roar of engines over Berlin. Dawn broke on June 6, 1944, beneath a low ceiling of clouds that threatened to hide the greatest armada of men and machines ever assembled. Madame Elise Fournier rose from her cellar and pressed to the doorway as the rumble began. At first she thought it thunder, but then it swelled, wave after wave, until the very earth shook. When she craned her neck, the clouds tore open, and she saw the impossible, the sky filled with aircraft, more than she had ever imagined a nation could possess. That morning, more than 11,500 Allied planes supported the invasion of Normandy. Fighters, bombers, gliders, transports. The air itself had become a highway of wings. In the weeks that followed, the Allies would fly nearly 480,000 sorties in support of Overlord, losing 4,101 aircraft, but establishing an air supremacy so complete that German units barely dared to move in daylight. Elise clutched her children as American C-47 transports droned overhead, parachutes blooming like dandelions in the gray dawn. To her, it looked as though the heavens themselves were delivering liberation. For Karl Weber, now posted near Caen, The day was a nightmare of futility. His BF-109 sat on the airstrip with barely enough fuel for a short patrol. Orders crackled through radios, but only fragments of IJG-2 and JG-26 could muster sorties. He watched as comrades scrambled, barely 30 aircraft, rising against thousands. Some never returned. He felt not anger, but hollowness, the certainty that nothing he did could matter against such scale. Above him, Harrington's Mustang roared in formation, circling the beaches. His job was not to dogfight. It was to ensure the Luftwaffe never interfered. Yet the Luftwaffe barely appeared. The enemy's vaunted fighter arm had dwindled to sporadic gestures, while the blue-nosed Mustangs roamed with impunity. Harrington saw the beaches below. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword, choked with landing craft. He knew this was possible only because the skies belonged to them. Elise huddled in the cellar at night, listening to distant artillery. But when she emerged, she saw the wreckage of German trucks strafed to ruin, the fields scarred with parachutes, and the children running toward Allied soldiers. They carried rifles, yes, but also candy, chewing gum, and promises. For Carl, watching his squadron dissolve, the truth crystallized. The Luftwaffe was not defeated in battle. It had been outproduced, outsupplied, and rendered irrelevant before the first soldier touched sand. The invasion was not won on the beaches, he realized, but in the skies where Germany no longer flew. Months later, Karl Weber stepped off a train in America, wearing a patched Luftwaffe tunic, now marked with a POW armband. He expected hostility. Instead, he was struck silent by what he saw. Row upon row of automobiles stretching beyond the horizon, parked in station lots, city streets, factory yards. There were more cars here, he thought, than trucks in the entire Wehrmacht. The shock deepened as he was marched to the camp. Convoys of brand-new trucks rumbled past, olive-drab convoys bristling with supplies. He knew the figure whispered among prisoners. The U.S. Army had more than 2.4 million trucks, while Germany had struggled to field just 350,000. Here was the proof, rumbling by with tires black and shining. It was not just superiority, it was abundance on a scale that mocked his years of rationing and scarcity. Inside the camp, Carl saw American guards drinking coffee that steamed in the cold air. He caught the smell of bacon from a nearby mess. He remembered Luftwaffe breakfasts of thin bread, ersatz jam, and bitter chicory coffee, and he felt his chest tighten. Some prisoners murmured that this was no fair fight. Carl thought differently. This was what it meant to fight a democracy that had mobilized its factories and its farms. The numbers haunted him. America had produced more aircraft in 1944 alone than Japan across the entire war. He had seen contrails over Berlin, but now he understood what they meant. Not just machines in the air, but factories in every state, workers by the millions. A nation of mechanics and machinists. Even here, in peacetime towns, the streets were lined with civilian cars, more engines than the Luftwaffe had ever controlled. Carl walked past barbed wire and wooden barracks, but he was not thinking of captivity. He was thinking of Willow Run, of Seattle, of Fort Worth, names he had never seen but that had already defeated him. The war had not been lost in Berlin or Normandy. It had been lost the moment America's production lines awakened. That night, as he lay in his bunk, Carl whispered the words he had once thought propaganda. When I saw 300,000 American planes, I knew the Luftwaffe was dead. And now, among the endless automobiles of this strange, vast country, he knew why. Defeat was not measured in dogfights, but in parking lots filled with more engines than his nation could ever dream to build. Clara Miller stood before the bulletin board at Willow Run one afternoon, her shift whistle still ringing in her ears. The board displayed the latest figures, hourly tallies of liberators produced, monthly totals of aircraft completed nationwide. She paused, grease still on her fingertips, and read the impossible number aloud. 96,318 aircraft in 1944. The year wasn't yet over. and America had already built more planes than Japan would produce during the entire war. She thought of her brother flying in Europe and of Harrington's Mustang squadrons. Each statistic on that board was not an abstraction, but a lifeline. A single bomber required thousands of man-hours, tens of thousands of parts. Yet the United States was producing hundreds a day, faster than German flak could knock them down. For every 30 bombers lost in a raid, a day's production replaced them. The arithmetic was crushing. Meanwhile, the reports filtering back from the front were staggering. German aviation fuel had collapsed by 97%. By September 1944, barely 5,000 tons remained, compared to 175,000 that spring. Luftwaffe cadets logged more hours on bicycles and gliders than on engines. Pilots with fewer than 20 flight hours were sent against American formations crewed by veterans with hundreds. Karl Weber had lived that nightmare, watching sleek Messerschmitts lined up with no fuel to fly. The scale of American logistics dwarfed every other measure of the war. Trucks, 2.4 million procured by the Army, ensured constant supply, compared to Germany's 350,000. Eisenhower himself had called the deuce-and-a-half truck one of the Allies' most decisive weapons. Chocolate bars and cigarettes flowed as freely as bullets, symbols of a culture of abundance that contrasted with the ration lines of Europe. Elise Fournier had seen children clutching Hershey squares as though they were gold. Clara traced the production numbers on the board with her finger. She realized she was part of something far greater than rivets and aluminum skins. This was democracy forged into steel, liberty measured in engines and bomb loads. The war would not be won by tradition or martial pride. It was being won by statistics, by the sheer arithmetic of a nation that had transformed its factories into weapons. As she stepped back, the plant floor thundered with another engine test, the smell of oil thick in the air. Clara smiled grimly. The Luftwaffe was dying not in dogfights, but here, in the clatter of rivet guns and the roar of test stands. The numbers on the board were not just statistics, they were the death sentence of the Luftwaffe. The war ended with silence in the skies, where once contrails had stretched horizon to horizon. At airfields across America, rows of P-51 Mustangs and B-17 Fortresses sat mothballed, engines covered, canopies taped shut. They looked like sleeping giants, victorious yet exhausted. For Karl Weber, now a prisoner awaiting repatriation, the sight confirmed what he had known since that February morning in 1944. Germany had never stood a chance once American industry entered the war. He remembered the frost on his cockpit glass, the smell of burnt synthetic fuel, the grounded Messerschmitts. He thought of the 300,000 planes America had built, machines he had never seen together but had felt overhead in endless waves. He knew his Air Force had been defeated by more than pilots. It had been crushed by numbers. For Captain James Harrington, the war's end brought relief more than triumph. He walked Bodney's Field one last time, running a hand over the blue nose of his Mustang. He thought of comrades who had not returned, of bombers lost over the Ruhr, of contrails streaked with flame. Yet he also thought of the factories that never stopped, of the fuel trucks that always arrived, of the certainty that America's abundance had carried him home alive. For Madame Elise Fournier, liberation meant fields free of convoys and skies free of thunder. She watched her children play beneath clouds that carried no engines. Yet even in peace, she remembered the candy tossed from passing trucks, the first taste of freedom her children ever knew. The abundance had been as decisive as the bombs, proof that the world beyond occupation lived differently. For Clara Miller, the factory floor grew quiet, the rivet guns silenced. She packed away her bandana and gloves, knowing the war had ended, but that her work had mattered. She had built not just bombers, but victory. Democracy had armed itself through her hands. Together, these voices told one truth. America's triumph was not born of chance or tradition, but of an industrial democracy that turned citizens into soldiers, workers into warriors, and abundance into a weapon. The Luftwaffe was not defeated in the skies of Berlin or over Normandy. It was defeated in parking lots filled with cars, in convoys stretching for miles, in factories where statistics became steel. Karl's final words lingered, carrying the weight of a generation's realization. When I saw 300,000 American planes, I knew the Luftwaffe was dead.